Theodore Hood stood motionless before his father's mahogany casket at St. Michael's Cemetery, his tall frame rigid in his perfectly tailored black suit. At 42, he'd transformed Hood Construction from his father's modest local operation into a regional powerhouse that dominated the market. Yet Bernard Hood's approval had remained perpetually out of reach. A phantom Theodore had chased relentlessly through boardrooms and construction sites. The autumn wind carried the scent of fresh earth and recently cut grass. His wife of 15 years, Kristen Berry, pressed herself against his side, her manicured fingers squeezing his arm in what appeared to be a gesture of comfort. Theodore noticed the unfamiliar scent of her perfume, a detail his mind filed away automatically, like the countless other minute observations that had helped him build his empire. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Hood," muttered James Parker, one of the senior project managers who'd worked with Bernard for over 2 decades. The man's weathered face showed genuine grief as he shook Theodore's hand. "Thank you, James. Dad always spoke highly of you." Theodore's voice remained steady, controlled. He'd learned early in his career that success demanded perfect composure, even when delivering layoff notices or terminating multi-million-dollar contracts. The procession of mourners continued. Business associates in expensive suits mixed with construction workers in their Sunday best, all united in their respect for Bernard Hood. Theodore acknowledged each condolence with the appropriate combination of gratitude and solemnity, while his mind repeatedly returned to the peculiar circumstances of his father's death. "Your father was a great man," said Michael Chun, a longtime supplier. "He gave me my first contract when no one else would trust a new business. He had an eye for potential," Theodore replied, remembering how his father had built relationships with small suppliers, nurturing them into reliable partners. It was one of the many lessons Theodore had learned and expanded upon. As the crowd thinned, Theodore caught snippets of hushed conversations among the remaining mourners. So sudden. He was in such good shape. Ran every morning, didn't he? Never missed a day, rain or shine. Their words echoed Theodore's own doubts. The medical examiner had ruled it a heart attack, but the conclusion hadn't sat right with him. Bernard had been extraordinarily fit for his 68 years, maintaining a strict routine of 5-mile runs every morning. Theodore had always admired that dedication, even as he'd struggled to earn his father's approval in other areas. Sarah Martinez, his executive assistant, approached with red-rimmed eyes. "Mr. Hood, I've rescheduled all your meetings for the next week. The Morgan contract review can wait." "No," Theodore said firmly. "Keep tomorrow's meeting. Dad wouldn't want the business to suffer." He saw approval in Sarah's eyes. She'd worked with him long enough to understand that work was his anchor. The last of the mourners departed, leaving Theodore alone with Kristen. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. The unfamiliar perfume was stronger now, expensive, and slightly cloying. "You know why he had that heart attack?" she whispered, her voice carrying an unfamiliar edge that made Theodore's instincts surge to attention. "He caught me and your brother in his bed." Theodore's mind immediately began calculating, analyzing, but his face remained impassive. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught him the value of an unreadable expression. "But that's not the best part," Kristen continued, her words dripping with malice. "I've been poisoning your coffee for months, just like I did to him." She paused, savoring the moment. "Too bad you already drank today's cup." Theodore turned to face her fully, his 6'2" frame towering over her. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth as he reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone. With deliberate slowness, he held up the screen, showing her the active recording. "The police loved your confession," he said, his voice carrying the same tone he used when crushing competitors. "By the way, that coffee, I switched our cups." The color drained from Kristen's face, her carefully applied makeup now a mask of horror. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. "You should have learned more about me before you tried this," Theodore continued, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't lose. Ever." Kristen stumbled backward, her heel catching in the soft grass. Theodore didn't move to help her regain her balance. "How?" she managed to whisper. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to ensure you and Floyd won't escape the consequences." He checked his watch. A Patek Philippe his father had given him when Hood Construction landed its first major contract. "The police should be processing the evidence from our house right now. Every cup of coffee you doctored, every conversation you had with Floyd, all documented." "You can't prove anything," Kristen said, but her voice trembled. Theodore's laugh was cold. "You'd be surprised what money and connections can prove. Did you really think you could conspire with Floyd under my roof without me noticing? I built a billion-dollar company by paying attention to details." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You killed my father. You tried to kill me. Did you really think I'd let you live happily ever after with my worthless brother?" Kristen's face contorted with rage. "Your father was a controlling bastard, just like you. Floyd is twice the man you'll ever be." "Floyd is a weak, pathetic parasite," Theodore replied calmly. "And now he's a murderer's accomplice. I wonder how they'll handle prison. He couldn't even handle working a regular job." A police siren wailed in the distance, growing closer. Kristen's eyes widened with panic. "You should run," Theodore suggested, his tone conversational. "It won't help, but it might make things more interesting." He smiled, the expression reminiscent of a predator. "I do enjoy a good chase." As Kristen turned to flee, Theodore remained by his father's casket, perfectly composed. He placed a hand on the smooth wood. "I learned from you, Dad," he murmured. "Never show weakness, never forgive betrayal, and never, ever leave loose ends." He watched as 2 police cars pulled up to the cemetery entrance, their lights flashing. Detective Valerie Wood stepped out of the first car, her badge glinting in the autumn sun. She caught Theodore's eye and nodded slightly. Theodore straightened his tie and prepared to give his statement. The game was just beginning, and he intended to savor every moment of his revenge. 3 weeks before Bernard Hood's death, Theodore sat in his home office, reviewing security footage on multiple monitors. The cameras had been installed discreetly throughout his house, their presence known only to him and the elite security firm he'd hired. On one screen, Floyd Hood paced nervously in the dining room, waiting for their weekly family dinner to begin. Theodore leaned back in his leather chair, studying his younger brother's movements. At 39, Floyd still possessed the boyish good looks that had helped him charm his way out of countless problems. But years of hard living had left their mark. His designer clothes hung slightly loose on his frame, and his hands trembled as he checked his phone repeatedly. "Sir," Sarah Martinez's voice came through the intercom. "Your wife asked me to remind you about dinner." "Thank you, Sarah. You can head home now." Theodore switched off the intercom and rose, adjusting his cuffs. He'd kept his regular office hours despite it being Sunday. Another lesson from his father about dedication. The dining room was a study in understated luxury, with an antique mahogany table that could seat 16. Tonight, only 4 places were set. Theodore took his usual position at the head of the table, nodding to his father, who sat at the opposite end. "You're late," Bernard said sharply. "The market doesn't run itself on weekends." "No, it doesn't," Theodore agreed. The Morgan contract needed revisions. Bernard's expression softened slightly. "The shopping center development. Good. That's a $50 million project." 65 after the revisions, Theodore corrected, noting how Floyd's shoulders tensed at the casual mention of such large sums. Kristen entered from the kitchen, carrying a serving dish. "A family favorite, Bernard. Beef Wellington." "Thoughtful of you," Bernard replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Theodore watched the interaction carefully. Something was off about Kristen's solicitous behavior toward his father, just as something was wrong about the way Floyd couldn't seem to look directly at either of them. "How's the job search going, Floyd?" Bernard asked as Kristen served the food. Floyd's fork clattered against his plate. "Actually, I've got some promising leads. A friend of mine knows someone in commercial real estate." Another friend with connections. Theodore interrupted. Like the friend who convinced you to invest in that Bitcoin scheme last year. That was a legitimate opportunity, Floyd protested. The timing was just wrong. The timing's always wrong with you, isn't it? Theodore took a sip of wine. How much was it again? $200,000 from your trust fund. Boys, Bernard warned, but there was weariness in his voice rather than authority. Theodore noticed Kristen's hand brush Floyd's shoulder as she passed behind him. A gesture too intimate for his sister-in-law. His suspicions, already aroused by their recent behavior, crystallized into certainty. "Tell me, Floyd," Theodore said pleasantly. "How do you afford those Ferragamo shoes on unemployment? They're from this season's collection, aren't they?" Floyd shifted uncomfortably. "I had some savings." "Savings?" Theodore laughed. "You burned through your trust fund on get-rich-quick schemes and gambling. The only savings you've ever had came from Dad bailing you out." "That's enough," Bernard interjected, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "We're having dinner as a family." Theodore met his father's gaze. "Family? Is that what we're calling it now?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Kristen busied herself with her food, while Floyd drained his wine glass and immediately reached for the bottle. "How's the new project in Portland progressing?" Bernard asked, clearly attempting to change the subject. "On schedule and under budget," Theodore replied. Unlike Floyd's last attempt at joining the business. "What was the final cost overrun on that warehouse project?" $3 million. "I had supply chain issues," Floyd muttered. "You had competence issues," Theodore corrected. "The same issues you've had your entire life. Always looking for shortcuts, always expecting Dad to clean up your messes." Bernard set down his fork. "I said that's enough, Theodore. Your brother's trying to get back on his feet." "He's been trying to get back on his feet for 20 years, Theodore responded. "Meanwhile, I've turned your company into one of the largest construction firms in the region. But please, keep defending him. Keep enabling his failures." Floyd stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? Dad's golden boy. The big success story. You have no idea what's really going on around you." Theodore smiled coldly. "Don't I?" Kristen laid a hand on Floyd's arm. "Honey, sit down, please." The endearment hung in the air like smoke. Bernard's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he looked between his younger son and his daughter-in-law. Theodore watched the scene unfold with calculated interest. Floyd's face had gone pale, while Kristen seemed to realize her mistake too late. "I think," Theodore said quietly, "this dinner is over." He stood and walked to his home office, closing the door behind him. Through the security feeds, he watched as Floyd practically ran from the house, followed shortly by Kristen. Bernard sat alone at the table for a long time, his face a mask of confusion and growing suspicion. Theodore picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Roger, I need your services. Something's wrong in my house, and I want to know everything." He paused, listening. "Yes, everything. Whatever it costs. I want cameras, bugs, the works, and I want it done yesterday." He ended the call and turned back to the monitors, watching as his father finally rose from the table and walked slowly toward the front door. Bernard's posture showed his age for the first time Theodore could remember. "I warned you about Floyd," Theodore murmured to the empty room. "I warned you every time you bailed him out, every time you gave him another chance. Now look what it's cost you." He opened his laptop and began composing an email to his private investigator. Whatever was happening in his house, whatever scheme Floyd and Kristen were planning, he would uncover it. And when he did, there would be no mercy. Theodore Hood didn't believe in second chances. He believed in consequences. Detective Valerie Woods' office at the police department was a testament to organized chaos. Case files covered every available surface. Crime scene photos were pinned to a large corkboard, and her desk supported 3 computer monitors displaying different aspects of the Hood investigation. Theodore sat across from her, his posture relaxed but alert. He'd chosen the chair that gave him the clearest view of both the door and the detective's face, another habit born from years of business negotiations. The toxicology reports came back, Valerie said, sliding a folder across her desk. The coffee samples you provided tested positive for a sophisticated cocktail of poisons. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing. The combination was specifically chosen to mimic heart disease symptoms over time. My wife has a master's degree in biochemistry, Theodore replied. She left that career to play trophy wife, but clearly she kept up with her studies. Valerie nodded, making a note in her file. And you said you began collecting samples when? 2 weeks ago, after I noticed unusual behavior from both Kristen and my brother during our weekly family dinners. I had my security team install cameras in my home office, where I keep my coffee maker. The footage showed Kristen adding substances to my morning coffee on multiple occasions. That's when you started switching the cups. Theodore's smile was sharp. I've made it a habit never to drink anything Kristen prepares. I've been collecting samples and having them tested privately for weeks. The results matched what your lab found. Valerie leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. Mr. Hood, your wife and brother have disappeared. They cleaned out their accounts yesterday morning. We found evidence of extensive planning, fake passports, offshore accounts, the works. They'd been preparing this for months. Of course they had, Theodore said calmly. Floyd never could handle money, but Kristen's always been clever. She would have known they'd need an escape plan. There's more. Valerie spread several photographs across her desk. Your brother had significant gambling debts to Guillermo Carey. Theodore examined the photos. They showed Floyd entering and leaving an upscale building, known to house one of Carey's illegal casinos. How significant? 7 figures, Valerie replied. Our sources suggest the original plan was to inherit the company and sell it to cover the debts. Your father discovering their affair forced them to accelerate their timeline. Theodore absorbed this information with the same analytical detachment he applied to business decisions. Guillermo Carey, he owns several legitimate businesses in addition to his gambling operations, correct? Mr. Hood, Valerie's voice carried a warning tone. Whatever you're thinking. I'm thinking about justice, detective. My father was murdered. My wife and brother tried to kill me. Surely you don't expect me to sit idle while they escape. I expect you to let law enforcement handle this, Valerie said firmly. We have alerts at airports and border crossings. We'll find them. Theodore stood, straightening his jacket. Of course, detective. I have complete faith in your investigation. Valerie rose as well, her expression skeptical. Why don't I believe you? Because you're good at your job, Theodore replied honestly. But ask yourself this. If they've been planning this for months, do you really think airport alerts will stop them? They'll have multiple escape routes planned. And you think you can find them when we can't? Theodore moved to the door, then paused. Detective, do you know how I built Hood Construction into what it is today? By understanding that every person has a price, every system has a weakness, and every plan has a flaw. Floyd and Kristen might have planned their escape for months, but I spent decades learning how to hunt and eliminate threats to my business. Is that a confession, Mr. Hood? It's a statement of fact. Theodore replied. My father taught me that business isn't just about construction. It's about power, connections, and knowing how to use both. The detective crossed her arms. Your father's lessons seem to have shaped you significantly more than he ever knew. Theodore's expression hardened. He kept trying to save Floyd, to rehabilitate him. Every time Floyd failed, every time he stole or gambled away opportunities, our father forgave him. That forgiveness killed him. And you won't make the same mistake. Valerie watched him carefully. Detective Woods, let me be clear. I won't do anything illegal. I don't need to. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. This contains evidence of every embezzlement scheme Floyd and Kristen ran through my company. Bank transfers, falsified contracts, shell companies. All of it. I've been collecting evidence for weeks. Valerie took the folder. How did you know to start looking? Because I know Floyd. He's never changed since we were kids. Always taking, always destroying. The only difference is the scale. Theodore straightened his tie. The day I noticed him looking too comfortable in my house was the day I started digging. Your own brother, Valerie mused, and you felt nothing when you started investigating him. Theodore's laugh was devoid of humor. What I feel is irrelevant. Floyd and Kristen murdered my father. They tried to murder me. Feelings don't enter into it. He moved to leave again, but stopped at Valerie's voice. One more question, Mr. Hood. The recording from the funeral. You knew she would confess, didn't you? You orchestrated that moment. Theodore turned back, his expression unreadable. Detective, in business, timing is everything. The best deals happen when you can predict your opponent's moves before they make them. And your wife was just another business opponent. No, Theodore's voice was cold. She was a threat. And I eliminate threats. He gestured to the folder in her hands. Everything you need is in there. Bank records, surveillance footage, witness statements from my employees who caught them doctoring documents. Use it well. As Theodore left the police station, his phone buzzed. A text from Roger Connor. Found something. Dinner tonight. Theodore smiled as he got into his car. The investigation had given him what he needed. Official documentation of their crimes. Now, the real hunt could begin. The private dining room at the St. Charles Club embodied old money and discretion. Theodore Hood sat across from Roger Connor, his former college roommate who now ran Sentinel Security, a firm specializing in what Roger delicately called complicated situations. You look exactly the same as you did at Harvard, Roger remarked, cutting into his Wagyu steak. Still the most intense guy in the room. Theodore took a measured sip of water. He hadn't touched alcohol since discovering Kristen's poisoning attempt. I need your best people, Roger. My brother and wife have disappeared with company assets. Roger's jovial expression shifted to professional focus. How much are we talking about? Enough to make it worth your while. Theodore placed a thick envelope on the table. This is just the retainer. I want everything. Surveillance, phone records, financial tracking. And I want someone who can find people who don't want to be found. Roger picked up the envelope without checking its contents. I know just the person. Melvin Head, former CIA, specializes in fugitive recovery. He's not cheap. Neither am I. Theodore replied, his tone as sharp as when acquiring failing companies. I want him on this exclusively. Roger nodded, pulling out his phone. After a brief conversation, he looked up. He can meet us here in 30 minutes. Good. Theodore straightened his tie. While we wait, tell me about your international capabilities, particularly in Mexico. Roger's eyebrows rose slightly. You already have a lead. I have suspicions. Floyd's never been creative. He always runs to the same places, uses the same patterns. The question isn't where they've gone. It's who's helping them get there. Melvin Head arrived precisely on schedule. He was unremarkable in appearance. Medium height, medium build, graying hair. Exactly what you'd want in someone whose job was to disappear into crowds while tracking targets. Mr. Hood, Melvin said, taking the seat. Roger briefed me on the basics. You're looking for two fugitives, your wife and brother. Correct. Theodore pulled out a tablet, displaying photos of Floyd and Kristen. They've embezzled company funds and are implicated in my father's murder. The police are involved, but they're moving too slowly. Melvin studied the photos with professional detachment. Any idea of their resources? They cleaned out several accounts, totaling approximately $4 million. They have false identities arranged through connections to Guillermo Carey's organization. Melvin's expression didn't change at the mention of Carey's name, but Theodore noticed the subtle shift in his posture. The casino owner. Correct, Theodore said. His network is extensive. So is mine, Melvin replied. I'll need daily updates, credit card transactions, phone records, security camera footage. I want to know where they sleep, what they eat, and who they talk to. You'll have it, Theodore assured him. Now find them. Over the next week, Theodore established a command center in a secure office at Hood Construction's headquarters. Multiple screens displayed financial data, travel records, and surveillance feeds. Sarah Martinez coordinated with Melvin's team, maintaining a detailed timeline of Floyd and Kristen's movements. Sir, Sarah called out one morning. Melvin's on line 1. Theodore picked up immediately. Report. Your brother's not as clever as he thinks, Melvin said. They're using false identities arranged by one of Guillermo's associates, but they made mistakes. Kristen used her personal credit card at a gas station in Mexico City 3 days ago. Amateur move, Theodore murmured. She's getting sloppy. There's more, Melvin continued. They've been moving money through a series of shell companies, but the pattern is traceable. I recommend bringing in a forensic accountant. Theodore smiled coldly. Already done. Cora Bennett starts tomorrow. Cora arrived early the next morning, her reputation for financial investigation preceding her. She'd helped Theodore evaluate numerous acquisitions, known for finding irregularities others missed. I need everything, Theodore told her, providing access to the company's financial records. Every transaction, every contract, every subsidiary. Find out how deep this goes. Cora worked methodically, her fingers flying over her keyboard as she traced money through a labyrinth of accounts and shell companies. After 3 days of intense analysis, she requested a meeting. They've been clever, she admitted, spreading documents across Theodore's desk, but not clever enough. Floyd and Kristen have been siphoning money from the company for months through a sophisticated scheme involving subcontractors. Theodore examined the documentation. Show me. They created fake companies that appear to be legitimate subcontractors. Your company would pay them for services never rendered, and the money would be routed through a series of shells before ending up in accounts they controlled. How did they hide this from our auditors? The paperwork was perfect. Invoices, delivery confirmations, everything. Someone with inside knowledge of your company's processes helped set this up. Cora hesitated, then added, the interesting part is where the shell companies were registered. They all have connections to Guillermo Carey's legitimate businesses. Theodore leaned back, his expression darkening. How much total? Conservative estimate. $12 million over the past year. Cora pulled up more documents, but here's what's crucial. The paper trail implicates Carey's businesses in money laundering. If this documentation were to reach the authorities. It won't, Theodore interrupted. Not yet. This is leverage. Cora studied him carefully. Mr. Hood, Guillermo Carey is dangerous. His legitimate businesses are just a front. The stories about what happens to people who cross him. I'm counting on his reputation, Theodore said, moving to the window. Fear is useful, Cora. It makes people predictable. Carey fears exposure more than anything else. His entire empire depends on maintaining a legitimate facade. What are you planning? I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Theodore turned back to her. I want every piece of documentation showing connections between his businesses and these shell companies. Every transaction, every registration, every point of contact. Make it ironclad. Cora nodded slowly. It'll take a few days to compile everything properly. You have too. And Cora, his voice carried a clear warning. This stays between us. If anyone asks, you're doing routine audit work. After she left, Theodore called Roger. I need a meeting with Guillermo Carey. Make it happen. Are you insane? Roger's voice cracked slightly. The man's a psychopath. He once had a guy's fingers cut off for shorting him $5,000. Then he'll understand the importance of protecting his investments, Theodore said evenly. Set it up, Roger. Use whatever connections you need. This is a bad idea, Theo. A really bad idea. No, Roger. This is business. Theodore ended the call and turned back to the financial documents. Everything was falling into place. Floyd and Kristen thought they were clever, using Carrie's network to hide. They didn't realize they'd given Theodore exactly what he needed to destroy them all. Guillermo Carrie's official business headquarters occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise. The decor screamed new money, lots of gold trim and modern art that had clearly been chosen for price rather than taste. Theodore noted the security cameras covering every angle and the subtle bulges under the jackets of the men positioned strategically around the reception area. "Mr. Carrie will see you now," the receptionist announced. Theodore followed a suited guard through double doors into Carrie's inner sanctum. The office was designed to intimidate. Massive desk, artwork worth millions, and windows offering a god's-eye view of the city below. Guillermo Carrie rose as Theodore entered. He was shorter than Theodore had expected, but his presence filled the room. His tailored suit couldn't quite hide the street fighter's physique underneath. "Mr. Hood," Carrie's accent carried hints of his Mexican heritage. "This is an unexpected pleasure. I wasn't aware Hood Construction had interests in the entertainment industry." "We're always looking to diversify," Theodore replied smoothly, accepting the offered seat. "Your development projects have caught our attention." Carrie's smile was practiced. "Of course, though I have to wonder why Hood Construction's CEO came personally. Usually, these initial meetings are handled by development teams." "Usually," Theodore agreed, opening his briefcase. "But this isn't a usual situation." He placed a thick folder on Carrie's desk. The other man made no move to open it. "What exactly are we discussing, Mr. Hood?" "Mutual interests." Theodore leaned forward slightly. "You've been helping my brother and his lover hide. They're using infrastructure you provided. False identities, safe houses, transportation networks. Very professional." Carrie's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "No." Theodore opened the folder himself, spreading out documents. "These shell companies that have been siphoning money from Hood Construction. They're registered to addresses owned by your legitimate businesses. The money laundering scheme is quite sophisticated." "I'm impressed." "Mr. Hood," Carrie's voice carried a deadly edge. "You're making very dangerous accusations." "Not accusations. Observations." Theodore remained perfectly calm. "The police would be very interested in this documentation. But I'm a businessman. I believe we can help each other." Carrie studied him with cold eyes before nodding slightly. "What do you want?" "Information. And when the time comes, I want you to do nothing." "Nothing." Carrie leaned back, steepling his fingers. "When you find Floyd and Kristen, and I have no doubt you will find them, I don't want any interference from your organization. No warnings, no help, no resources. And in return, this evidence disappears." Theodore gestured to the documents. "Your legitimate businesses remain legitimate. Everyone wins." Carrie was silent for a long moment, evaluating. Finally, he opened a drawer and removed a flash drive. "Everything you need is here. Their current identities, locations of safe houses, contact protocols. But Mr. Hood," his eyes glittered dangerously, "if any of those documents ever surface—" "They won't," Theodore interrupted, pocketing the drive. "As long as you uphold your end. You're either very brave or very stupid, coming here like this." "Neither. I'm just thorough." Theodore stood, straightening his jacket. "You should know, I have multiple copies of everything in that folder, set to be released automatically if anything happens to me." "Of course you do." Carrie's smile was genuine this time. "You know, in different circumstances, we could have done business together. We just did." Theodore moved to the door, then paused. "One more thing. I know about the support they're getting from your operation in Mexico City. That ends now." Carrie picked up his phone as Theodore left. The message would be sent. Floyd and Kristen were on their own now. In the elevator, Theodore allowed himself a small smile. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Floyd and Kristen thought they were safe under Carrie's protection. They were about to learn how quickly that safety could vanish. The coastal town of Puerto Vallarta sparkled in the Mexican sun. Tourists and locals mingled on the streets below as Theodore watched through high-powered binoculars from his hotel room balcony. After a week of surveillance, he'd established Floyd and Kristen's patterns with military precision. They were staying in a rented villa under the names James and Sarah Mitchell, burning through their stolen money while planning their escape to South America. Theodore's team had confirmed tickets purchased to Brazil under different aliases, a journey they would never complete. Movement at the villa. Melvin's voice crackled through Theodore's earpiece. Target 1 is heading to his usual bar. Target 2 is preparing for her morning walk. Theodore checked his watch. 10:15 a.m., right on schedule. Floyd's drinking had gotten worse since they'd fled, starting earlier each day. Kristen had taken to long walks alone on the beach, perhaps trying to escape the reality of what their lives had become. Maintain surveillance on Target 1. Theodore instructed. I'll handle Target 2. Sir. Melvin's tone carried a warning. We should stick to the plan. Let the local authorities. The plan has changed. Theodore interrupted, his voice brooking no argument. Just make sure Floyd stays at that bar. He waited until Kristen was halfway through her usual route before making his move. She'd chosen a relatively isolated stretch of beach, away from the tourist crowds. Her head was down, lost in thought, when Theodore stepped into her path. Hello, Kristen. She froze, then turned slowly. The weeks on the run had taken their toll. Her designer clothes looked worn, and her carefully maintained appearance showed signs of strain. How did you find us? I had help, the same way I had help gathering evidence of every crime you and Floyd committed. The embezzlement, the murders. He stepped closer, noting how she instinctively backed away. Did you really think you could take everything from me and just disappear? You don't understand, Kristen began, her voice shaking. I understand perfectly, Theodore interrupted coldly. You killed my father. You tried to kill me. And now, I'm here to make sure you both face the consequences. Kristen's eyes darted around, scanning the beach for any sign of an escape route. Her body was tense, her breath quickening. What are you going to do to me? Theodore tilted his head, a predator examining prey. Me? Nothing. You're going to destroy yourself, just like you and Floyd always do. He pulled out a small leather portfolio and opened it, revealing photographs, bank statements, and travel records. But first, I thought you might like to know exactly how your beloved Floyd has been preparing for his future. Kristen's face paled as he handed her a bank statement. Her trembling hands clutched the paper. What is this? That, Theodore said smoothly, is proof that Floyd has been emptying your shared accounts into his own. Separate accounts. Secret accounts. Notice how the transfers start small, barely noticeable, and grow over time. You're lying, she hissed, though her voice wavered. Theodore gave her a pitying smile. Am I? Then explain this. He handed her another document, a one-way ticket to Brazil, purchased under Floyd's alias. Floyd's name. Floyd's money. Floyd's ticket. Just one. Kristen stared at the papers, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. No, he wouldn't do this. He wouldn't leave me. Theodore folded his arms, his tone sharp. Really? Because that's exactly what he's been planning while you've been wandering the beach, clinging to the illusion of your partnership. Deep down, you know it's true. You've seen the signs, haven't you? Her lips trembled as she struggled to speak. Why are you telling me this? What do you want? Theodore stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. What I want is simple. Justice. And for once, I'm giving you a choice. Confess to everything. Testify against Floyd and Guillermo Carey. Do that, and I'll ensure you serve your sentence in a minimum security prison, a place where you'll still have a semblance of a life. Or, Kristen's voice cracked. Or what? Or stay with Floyd, Theodore said coldly. Watch him drain the last of your money. Watch him vanish while you're left behind to face the authorities alone. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, hunted, desperate, and powerless. Tears filled Kristen's eyes as her grip on the papers faltered. How do I know you'll keep your word about the prison? Because unlike Floyd, Theodore said, his tone razor-sharp, I understand the value of keeping promises. Here. He pulled a burner phone from his pocket and handed it to her. This has one number programmed into it, Detective Valerie Woods. Use it to make the deal. You have 24 hours. Kristen hesitated, staring at the phone as if it might explode. And if I don't? Theodore's expression turned to steel. Then I release everything. The embezzlement records, the evidence of your involvement in my father's murder, the shell company connections. The authorities will hunt you down like the criminal you are. He turned to leave, then paused, looking over his shoulder. Oh, and Kristen, don't try to warn Floyd. My people are watching. One wrong move, and the deal is off. As he walked away, Theodore spoke into his earpiece. Melvin, ensure Floyd stays at the bar. Kristen needs some time to stew. Understood, Melvin replied. Target 1 is still drinking heavily. No sign he suspects anything. Theodore returned to his hotel, where he watched the events unfold through his surveillance feeds. Kristen returned to the villa, clutching the phone and the documents like lifelines. Floyd stumbled in hours later, his breath reeking of alcohol and his movements unsteady. The tension between them was palpable, their once fragile alliance unraveling before Theodore's eyes. Sir, Melvin's voice came through again. Target 1 has been attempting to access his Brazilian accounts. He's made 3 failed attempts to log in today. Looks like he's getting sloppy. Good, Theodore replied, his voice cool. Let him feel the pressure. Fear makes people careless. As the sun set over Porto Vallarta, the villa became a stage for Theodore's meticulously orchestrated drama. Kristen's darting glances and nervous fidgeting only fed Floyd's growing paranoia. Every time he checked his phone or disappeared into another room, her suspicion deepened. They were trapped in a psychological war, neither trusting the other, both believing they could outmaneuver the other. Theodore leaned back in his chair, a glass of water in hand, and murmured, Sometimes the best weapon is the truth. You just have to know how to use it. By the following morning, the cracks in Floyd and Kristen's alliance had widened into a chasm. Theodore's surveillance showed Kristen clutching the burner phone, her finger hovering over the call button. Floyd, meanwhile, paced the villa like a caged animal, muttering angrily to himself. Sir, Melvin's update broke through Theodore's thoughts. Target 2 has made the call to Detective Woods. She's offering to turn herself in. Theodore smiled, his satisfaction cold and calculated. And so it begins. Kristen's voice trembled as she spoke into the burner phone. Detective Woods, I want to make a deal. I have information on Floyd Hood, Guillermo Carey, and the murder of Bernard Hood. I'll confess to everything. Through his surveillance feed, Theodore watched as Floyd, drunk and agitated, stumbled into the room and caught sight of her. His bloodshot eyes narrowed as they locked onto the phone in her hand. What deal? Floyd's voice slurred with rage. Kristen spun around, the phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. Floyd, she stammered, backing away as he advanced on her. You treacherous bitch. Floyd lunged for her, his alcohol-fueled fury transforming into violence. You're going to sell me out, after everything we've been through. Kristen stumbled over a chair, her hands raised in defense. Floyd, stop. You were planning to leave me. I saw the bank accounts, the ticket to Brazil. You were going to run without me. Floyd froze for a moment, then sneered. So that's what this is about. Theodore got to you, didn't he? Showed you some papers, made you think I was going to betray you. Were they lies? Kristen shouted back, her voice hoarse. Tell me those accounts don't exist. Tell me you weren't planning to abandon me. Instead of answering, Floyd lunged again, this time grabbing her by the arm. "You're just as weak as he always said. You'd rather trust Theodore than stand by me." Through the cameras, Theodore observed their confrontation with detached interest. Every accusation, every confession, was being recorded, evidence he could use to seal their fates. "Sir," Melvin's voice crackled through his earpiece, "it's escalating. Should we intervene?" "Not yet," Theodore replied, his tone icy. "Let them expose everything first." Inside the villa, Kristen broke free from Floyd's grip and grabbed a shard of the shattered vase from the floor. "You don't get to put this on me," she screamed, slashing at him wildly. "You're the reason we're here. You're the one who dragged me into this." Floyd stumbled back, his hand flying to his cheek, now streaked with blood. His face twisted in a mixture of pain and fury. "Dragged you into this. You planned this. You poisoned Bernard. You convinced me to steal from Theodore. None of this would have happened without you." Kristen's laugh was bitter and broken. "Because you were too spineless to do it on your own. I did everything to protect us, and you were going to throw me away the moment it got hard." "Sir," Melvin said again, his voice tense, "we have officers on standby. If we don't move now—" "Move in," Theodore commanded. "Make sure Floyd doesn't run." As Floyd lunged for Kristen again, the villa's front door burst open, and armed police officers stormed in. Floyd turned to run, but two officers tackled him to the ground. Kristen collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, as another officer secured her wrists in handcuffs. Theodore watched it all unfold through his feeds, a faint smile of satisfaction playing on his lips. "Perfect," he murmured. Outside the villa, Floyd was hauled to his feet, his face smeared with blood and rage. "You want a confession?" He screamed at the officers. "Fine. We killed him. We killed Bernard because he was going to cut me off, and Kristen, she's just as guilty." Theodore's smile widened as Floyd's drunken confession spilled from his lips. The police recorded every word, ensuring there would be no ambiguity in court. Detective Woods, who had arrived on the scene moments earlier, caught sight of Floyd's outburst and glanced toward the unmarked car where Theodore sat watching. She met his gaze, her expression a mix of respect and suspicion. As the chaos unfolded, Kristen was loaded into a second police car, her face a mask of defeat. Floyd's shouts echoed across the beach as he was driven away, his words slurred but damning. "You think you've won, Theodore. You don't know what you've unleashed." In the distance, the waves crashed against the shore, drowning out the last of Floyd's protests. Theodore remained in his car, his expression impassive. Everything had gone according to plan. The two people who had betrayed him so completely were now facing the full weight of the law, their alliance shattered by their own mistrust and desperation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Theodore turned to Melvin, who sat in the passenger seat. "Make sure the recordings are delivered to Detective Woods, and remind her that all of this was their doing, not mine." Melvin nodded. "Understood, sir. Anything else?" Theodore's gaze lingered on the villa, now swarming with law enforcement. "Yes, arrange for the property to be cleaned and put back on the market. It's time to move on." As the car pulled away, Theodore allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. His father's killers had been brought to justice. His company was secure, and his own reputation remained untarnished. Floyd and Kristen had destroyed themselves, exactly as he had predicted. Revenge, Theodore mused, wasn't just about punishment. It was about precision, control, and ensuring the consequences of betrayal were felt for a lifetime. 6 months later, Theodore Hood sat in his office at Hood Construction's headquarters, reviewing the final legal reports tied to Floyd and Kristen's downfall. The morning sun illuminated the city skyline, casting long shadows over the company his father had built and he had fortified. The documents before him painted a picture of justice, executed with surgical precision. Floyd had been sentenced to life in prison for the murder of their father and the attempted murder of Kristen. His drunken confession at the villa, coupled with the mountain of evidence Theodore had accumulated, made the prosecution's case airtight. Kristen, true to her deal with Detective Woods, had been sentenced to 20 years in a minimum security facility. Her comprehensive testimony about the embezzlement, the murder plot, and Guillermo Carey's involvement was the foundation of a massive federal investigation. Sarah Martinez entered the office, a stack of newspapers in hand. "Sir, the headlines are all about the Carey organization takedown." Theodore scanned the front pages, his satisfaction visible only in the slight quirk of his lips. The Joint Task Force did well. Guillermo Carey's empire unraveled faster than even I anticipated. Carey himself is still missing, Sarah said. The rumors suggest he's somewhere in South America, constantly on the move. Exactly where I want him, Theodore replied. Living in perpetual fear of discovery is a punishment all its own. A knock at the door announced Detective Valerie Woods. She entered without waiting for permission, her sharp gaze sweeping over the pristine office. "Quite a neat little bow you've tied on everything," she remarked, declining the chair Theodore gestured to. Floyd confessing on tape, Kristen turning state's evidence, Carey's organization in ruins. It's almost too perfect. Theodore met her gaze without flinching. Sometimes, Detective, justice prevails. He raised his coffee cup. "Drink." Wood smirked but shook her head. "No, thanks. Some cups are better left undrunk." She crossed her arms, studying him. "You orchestrated all of this, didn't you? Played Floyd and Kristen against each other. Set them up to destroy themselves." Theodore leaned back, his expression unreadable. "That's an interesting theory. Are you suggesting I somehow made my brother and wife embezzle millions, murder my father, and betray each other?" "I'm suggesting," Woods countered, "you knew exactly how they'd react when pushed. You set the stage. You didn't need to push them off the edge. They jumped on their own." Theodore's smile was sharp. "You're giving me too much credit, Detective. I simply ensured the truth came to light. The rest was their doing." Wood studied him for a moment longer before turning toward the door. "You know," she said, pausing, "the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who use violence. They're the ones who use the law itself as a weapon." "An interesting perspective," Theodore replied. "I prefer to think of it as justice. My father's murder has been avenged, the guilty have been punished, and Hood Construction is stronger than ever." After she left, Theodore opened his desk drawer and removed an old photograph of Bernard Hood, standing proudly in front of their first major construction project. He placed it on his desk, angling it toward the window so it overlooked the city. "You taught me well, Dad," he murmured. "But forgiveness wasn't your strongest lesson." Sarah returned with a report on the Bernard Hood Foundation. "The new initiative is up and running. We're now helping over 10,000 families affected by addiction and fraud annually." Theodore nodded approvingly. "A fitting legacy for my father. Use the funds we recouped from Floyd and Kristen's accounts to expand the foundation's reach." "And Guillermo Carey?" Sarah asked cautiously. "He remains useful," Theodore said. "As long as he stays in hiding, his presence is a reminder to others of what happens when you cross me. If he resurfaces, we'll deal with him." Later that evening, Theodore visited St. Michael's Cemetery. His father's grave was immaculately maintained, fresh flowers delivered weekly. The black granite headstone now bore the new Hood Construction logo, a symbol of the company's evolution. "You were right about so many things, Dad," Theodore said quietly. "But you were wrong about forgiveness. Mercy doesn't build empires, it destroys them." His phone buzzed, a notification about Floyd attempting yet another appeal, which had already been denied. Theodore dismissed it without a second thought. Every aspect of Floyd's imprisonment was carefully monitored to ensure his suffering remained precise and perpetual. Back at his penthouse, Theodore hosted a dinner for his executive team. The view of the city stretched out below, Hood Construction's new tower dominating the skyline. Sarah presented expansion plans for the next decade, outlining new markets and acquisitions. When the meal concluded, Theodore raised his glass of water. "To consequences," he toasted. The executives echoed the sentiment, none missing the significance of his words. They had all witnessed the lengths he went to protect what was his. As the evening wound down, Theodore returned to his home office and reviewed the latest reports. Floyd's prison records showed a man broken by his own guilt and paranoia, endlessly pacing his cell and muttering about conspiracies. Kristen, still in the minimum security facility, had developed rituals around her food and drink, convinced she might be poisoned. Their lives had become monuments to betrayal's price, a constant reminder that crossing Theodore Hood carried consequences that lasted a lifetime. As Theodore gazed at the city lights, a faint smile crossed his lips. He had built an empire and ensured its survival by mastering the art of precision. Betrayal wasn't just punished, it was transformed into a lesson for all who dared to challenge him. Some questions, Theodore reflected, were better left unasked. Some cups better left undrunk. But one truth remained. In his world, betrayal was not forgiven. It was annihilated. 10 years later, Theodore Hood stood at the podium in front of Hood Construction's new global headquarters, addressing a crowd of media, employees, and business leaders gathered for the tower's inauguration. At 52, his presence commanded even more authority than before. Years of success had honed his edge to razor-sharp precision. "This tower represents more than corporate expansion," Theodore announced, his voice carrying easily over the assembled audience. "It represents resilience. 10 years ago, Hood Construction faced a threat from within, a betrayal that could have destroyed everything my father built. Instead, we emerged stronger, smarter, and more determined." The crowd erupted into applause, a testament to the legacy Theodore had forged. Standing at the side of the stage, Sarah Martinez, now the company's COO, watched with a mixture of pride and respect. She had been at Theodore's side during the darkest days of the company, and had risen through the ranks to become his most trusted executive. Under their leadership, Hood Construction had quadrupled in size, with projects spanning 3 continents. Its influence was unmatched, and its reputation for precision and loyalty had become industry legend. After the ceremony, Theodore returned to his new office at the top of the tower. Cora Bennett was waiting for him, her tablet loaded with financial reports. "The quarterly numbers exceed projections by 30%, she reported. "And the Bernard Hood Foundation is reaching more people than ever, over 15,000 families annually." "Good," Theodore replied. "And the other investments?" Cora hesitated, then nodded. "Floyd's appeal was denied last month, his 7th attempt. He remains in maximum security after that failed escape attempt 3 years ago. The psychological evaluations describe him as completely broken. He spends most of his days writing rambling letters to regulatory agencies about corporate corruption, but none of them are coherent enough to warrant attention." "And Kristen?" Theodore's tone was neutral, but his words carried weight. "Still in the minimum security facility in California. Eligible for parole in 5 years, Cora said. According to the prison psychiatrist, her paranoia has worsened. She won't eat or drink anything she hasn't personally sealed and stored. The staff has noted the irony." Theodore's cold smile returned. "The Bernard Hood Foundation makes annual donations to both facilities, I assume." "Of course," Cora replied. "Anonymous, as always. It ensures they have every opportunity to reflect on their choices." Sarah appeared in the doorway with Theodore's afternoon schedule. "Roger Connor called earlier. He wanted you to know he's retiring and selling his security firm. He also thanked you for the business over the years." "Send him something appropriate," Theodore said. "He was invaluable during the hunt." That evening, Theodore visited St. Michael's Cemetery, where his father's grave remained a testament to the family legacy. The black granite headstone bore the Hood Construction logo, a symbol of the empire Bernard Hood had founded and Theodore had transformed. "You were right about strength, Dad," Theodore murmured to the grave. "But you never understood the cost of forgiveness. You gave Floyd too many chances, and it killed you." I won't make the same mistake. Later, he hosted a private dinner in his penthouse for the executive team. The city stretched out below, Hood Construction's tower dominating the skyline. Plans for further expansion were laid out. New markets, acquisitions, and opportunities to extend the company's influence. As the evening concluded, Theodore raised his glass of water. "To consequences," he said. The team echoed the toast. They all understood the meaning behind the words. Everyone in the company had witnessed what happened to those who betrayed Theodore Hood. They had learned to fear the precision of his justice and the lengths he would go to protect what was his. Before retiring for the night, Theodore reviewed the latest surveillance updates on Floyd and Kristen. Floyd continued to pace his cell, muttering conspiracies and writing incoherent letters. Kristen remained in her self-imposed isolation, her rituals around food and drink reinforcing her paranoia. Their lives, Theodore reflected, were the ultimate monuments to the consequences of betrayal. Both had been destroyed, not by him, but by their own actions. He had merely set the stage, and they had played their parts to perfection. As the city lights reflected off his office windows, Theodore turned to his plans for the next decade. Hood Construction would continue to grow, its legacy cemented in the towering skyline and the shattered lives of those who had dared to betray its architect. Some cups were indeed better left undrunk, and some debts better left unpaid. But betrayal, that always carried a price. And in Theodore Hood's world, that price was eternal. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.